This episode is brought to you by Strength Portal. You need a single software platform that enables your trainers to deliver consistent, high-quality workouts, track client progress, and scale your business. The problem is you're still using pen and paper or basic spreadsheets to run your business, which leads to poor client experiences, inaccurate tracking, and prevents you from growing your business, making you feel frustrated. Strength Portal understand your challenge and have worked closely with the HIIT industry to create a software platform to manage and scale your niche business. You can integrate with MindBody, manage a standardized exercise and workout library for your team, track workouts effectively, and produce client reports at the click of a button. Strength Portal is used by multiple businesses in the high-intensity strength training community, namely Discover Strength, Smart Strength Austin, MedX Precision Fitness, and more. Starting with Strength Portal is super simple. Number 1, sign up for the best package for your business. Number 2, let Strength Portal take the load off and help onboard your business onto the platform. And number 3, start delivering consistent workout experiences and scale your business to the next level. To help support the podcast, please go to strengthportal.com/high intensity business and sign up now so you can stop feeling frustrated about your business and start to scale your business to its true potential. Go to strengthportal.com/high intensity business. Lawrence Neal here, and welcome back to High Intensity Business, a podcast where we discuss high intensity strength training and provide you with the tools, the tactics, and strategies to help you grow your strength training business. This is episode 379, and today we'll be reviewing a paper called Comparison of the Effects of Velocity-Based versus Traditional Training Methods, Resistance Training Methods in Strength, Power, and Sprint Speed, a systematic review, meta-analysis, and quality of evidence appraisal. And today's guest is Dr. Sam Orange, PhD. Sam is a lecturer in exercise physiology and Deputy Director of Research in the School of Biomedical Sciences at the Newcastle University. He's also part of the Newcastle University Centre for Cancer. Sam's research focuses on finding the best ways to support cancer survivors to be physically active and whether physical activity can improve some side effects of cancer and cancer treatment. His research also looks at the biological mechanisms underlying how physical activity prevents certain cancers, particularly bowel cancer. Sam has a keen interest in strength training himself, and from a personal perspective, he is a former professional rugby league player and has competed nationally in powerlifting. From a research standpoint, he's led studies with professional athletes, looking at whether using velocity feedback, obviously what we're talking about today, to regulate resistance training load can improve strength and power. He maintains a strong interest in this research field, mostly from the perspective of improving the quality, openness, and transparency of research conducted in this area, which is very refreshing to see. Sam, welcome to podcast. Great to speak to you.
Thanks, Lawrence. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. So excited to talk to you about this study. Got tons of questions prepared. Do you want to just kick off by explaining to my audience the purpose of the study, just introducing it at a high level?
Yeah, absolutely. So the purpose of the study was to have a look at whether using velocity feedback to regulate resistance training load compared to more traditional approaches to prescribing resistance training load can improve strength, power, and sprint speed adaptations. So we're comparing, it was a systematic review, and we were reviewing the literature to have a look at the studies that have compared what we call velocity-based training to more traditional resistance training, and seeing if there's a difference there in terms of adaptations in power, strength, and sprint speed. Why I think that was really important to do is because velocity-based training is really, really popular. There's opinion pieces on it in the published literature, several blogs on it that some I've contributed to myself. There's actually guidelines how to implement velocity-based training. There's podcasts on it. Hence, we're talking about it today. I said there's blogs, and there's a whole industry built on velocity-based training. There's gym-aware devices, and there's other the push band and other devices that are essentially form an industry based on velocity-based training. And I wasn't so sure that the evidence actually matched the hype. So what we wanted to do was really take an evidence-based approach and have a look whether there were any long-term differences in using this type of training mode.
Great, yeah. Great way to start. And just for those listening, kind of a funny side note. As I was saying to Sam before we got recording, I read the title of this paper and thought, wow, this is all about velocity of resistance training, and in terms of what's the most effective for strength, power, and speed. And that's not what this is about at all. It's about obviously looking at the loading range, how you prescribe that. So just to make that distinction, because I know that some of my audience, but most of them are smarter than me, but some of them probably maybe make the same mistake. So just to make that distinction clear. So can you just start with some definitions, right? So I actually had no idea about this. I am very ignorant when it comes to powerlifting, which is obviously where this is used mostly. And I had no idea this was so popular, that there was all these, like you say, methodologies, all this content online, all these people that have published research about it, until obviously I come across this. So what is velocity feedback exactly?
So it's not where the mistake comes a lot of time. People think it's a single training method, but it's not really. Velocity-based training is more of a paradigm. So it's about using velocity feedback to monitor and manipulate resistance training load to then, in turn, enhance adaptations. So it's more of a paradigm, and there's different ways you can do that, which I'll explain in a second. But again, it's more about using that velocity feedback while you're resistance training to monitor and then manipulate your own resistance training load. And it's built, so velocity-based training is built on the premise that changes in velocity are indicative of a person's performance capability, both on a given day and over time. So as a quick example, on a given day, if the velocity you're lifting 100 kilos in the back squat, if your concentric velocity is much slower than it has been over the past few weeks, you're probably a bit tired. And if it's over time, if you're lifting 100 kilos in the back squat and velocity is increasing, you've probably got a little bit stronger. And so it's based on this premise that velocity correlates really nicely with an athlete's performance capabilities. And there's two main ways that it can be implemented, really. Or I like to split it down to two main ways. One,
sorry, quick interjection. Is that proven? Is there evidence to show that velocity is based on what was it you said there? Sorry.
So it's if you're a little bit tired, what's been shown is that the across the load, if you lift a lighter load, you're going to lift faster, and if you lift a heavier load, it's going to be a bit slower. So almost extrapolating from that, it's that okay then, if on a given day, if you're going to lift a weight slower than you usually do, you're probably not as, let's call it, neuromuscularly ready. There's probably a little bit less of neuromuscular preparedness, let's say. You're probably a little bit tired. And there has been studies that have correlated things like reductions in counter movement jump and things like that with lower velocities.
And this is interesting. So yeah, talking about recovery, you talk about in the paper, if people have had consecutive poor night's sleep or high stress, this can eat into recovery. Obviously, a lot of us know this, but there's this, what seems quite controversial to me is this idea of central nervous system fatigue. Is this a actual defined phenomenon? Is it like studied? Can we objectively look at what that is, and is there any research to show that there's some kind of central nervous system fatigue? Because that's very different to what you just said there, which is more local, right? Muscular. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You can't pinpoint using just velocity-based training. If your velocity is a little bit lower, there's no way of pinpointing where that fatigue is located in the body, whether it's more local or it's more centrally. There's a lot of space in this research, a really lot of space to really answer some of those more interesting questions. And, ways to do that. I know my colleagues, when I was at Northumbria as a postdoc, they look a lot into central nervous system fatigue using something called transcranial magnetic stimulation.
So it is a thing then?
So it is, yeah. You can look at,
Okay.
yeah. So central nervous system fatigue is a thing, yeah,
Okay,
absolutely.
got it. Wow.
It
Okay.
is it is a thing, but there's been no, we're not even close to doing any studies that are linking central nervous system fatigue to velocity loss in a resistance training context.
What
So
about, yeah, I know we're going a little bit off topic here, but I'm just curious. What about, okay, velocity loss, yes, but what about, is there anything out there talking about central nervous system fatigue and its impact on, strength or performance, any performance outcome? Or is that just so hard to study right now, as you were kind of alluding to?
So more central nervous system fatigue tends to reduce your force
Okay.
generating capacity. So yeah, more central nervous system fatigue, you reduce essentially the motor input into the muscle, and you're going to reduce your force generating capacity. I'm going to put a caveat on there that my specialism very much isn't central nervous system fatigue and tracking that. I do have some colleagues who could tell you a lot more about that than I can, but to my understanding, absolutely, if there's some fatigue, whether it's centrally or more locally in the muscle, there's going to be a reduction in force generating capacity.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's just, I appreciate you making the caveat, and it's something which I just didn't honestly know if that was one of those things that gets banded about CNS fatigue. You see it in lots of influencers talking about that kind of thing. Whether that was actually evidence based, I wasn't sure about that.
If I can just interject as well,
please.
Lawrence, I think it does get bandied about too much. I think we talked in a preamble, we talked about the average Joe training, and I really think the average Joe training for 3 times a week for 45 minutes to an hour at a time, and resistance training, wherein in that session most of it is rest. You might be actually lifting weights for maybe 15 minutes. Most of it is interset rest. That central nervous system probably isn't a problem for the majority of us.
Got it. So listeners, what Sam is kind of saying there is that he kind of likes the idea of high intensity training, because he's talking about 15 minutes of time under tension.
Yes.
That's just my bias. So no, thank you for that. And what is so what are the tools that are being used in this space to measure this kind of thing? Because I saw a couple of acronyms, again, something I really don't know much about.
Yeah, absolutely. There's several tools on the market now. The gold standard practical tool, so that you'd use essentially in training sessions with athletes, is I would consider the linear position transducer, and that's what we tend to use in studies. So that essentially you attach a floor unit to a floor, and then it has a cable that retracts into it, and then you attach that cable onto a barbell, and that what it does is directly measure displacement of the barbell, and then uses several equations then to measure velocity and power. And that's been shown to really be, that technique has been shown to be very valid and very reliable. There are a couple of other techniques you can use, things like inertial measurement units, which are accelerometers with gyroscopes attached to either the forearm or the barbell, but they have a little bit less evidence supporting their reliability and validity.
Got it. So LPT for short is what people might refer to.
That's the one.
Yeah, I saw that. I was like, "What the hell is that?" You've got to be careful and trip on that wire, there, right? It's pretty. Got to be conscious.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there have been in studies. I've had some participants been a little bit too rigorous, let's say, with the wire, and I've given them a little bit of a talking to afterwards.
Yeah. Get it wrapped around your ankle as you go into a snatch or something.
Yes, maybe.
So I'm curious, without giving the game away, obviously we'll talk about the result at the end of this. But before doing this study, did you use any velocity-based training yourself, whether that was in rugby or powerlifting or anything else you've been involved in? And did you have a view of whether it was more effective than traditional resistance training for,
I have used a little bit of velocity-based training myself, and so I'll give a little preface to that. I feel like there's two main methods of velocity-based training. One is as a training monitoring tool. It can potentially, so just as a purely monitoring tool where you're having some velocity feedback, but you're not necessarily acting on that feedback to change the load that you're lifting.
Okay.
And for example, that can be a motivation tool. Okay, I really want to lift this weight at 0.7 meters per second because last week it was 0.65. And it could potentially help do things like, track adaptation. Okay, I'm lifting this weight a little bit faster over time. I've probably got a little bit stronger. And then there's so that's a monitoring tool, but you can also use it to then manipulate load. And two main ways of doing that is velocity loss thresholds. So if I might say, okay, I'm going to stop lifting when my velocity reduces by 10%. So if I'm lifting at 0.8 meters per second and my velocity then goes to below 0.72 meters per second, below 10%, I would then stop. Or velocity zones where I say, okay, I'm going to lift between, as an example, between 0.6 and 0.7 meters per second, and I'm going to stay within that zone. And if I go above that zone, I'm going to add weight. And if I'm below the zone, I'm going to reduce the weight. I've used velocity-based training myself as a training monitoring tool. I do find it quite motivating, sometimes to get that feedback. And I really don't think that's surprising, actually. So physiological feedback is a well-known, in other research fields, is a well-known behavior change technique. So, for example, if you take a group of inactive people who don't exercise, give them heart rate monitors, and when they exercise, they can see their heart rate increasing, their physiology is changing. That's a motivational tool in itself. And I think what we're seeing with velocity-based training is that can also motivate, people who are active. And so I have used it myself. I've had no experiences, N equals 1 and all that. But I've had no experiences that it's use it as to manipulate load any better than other forms of any other forms of training.
Cool. Okay. Thank you for that. So, we talked about, due to obviously fluctuating daily performance, there's a kind of one of the hypotheses in the introduction was that, prescribing load based on percentage of one repetition max, which is common in more traditional resistance training, may be suboptimal, and that this approach using velocity-based feedback might be a bit more accurate in terms of making the training load more effective, right? Mm-hmm. Velocity-based training, just got some notes here, provides instant velocity feedback to objectively monitor and adjust the resistance training load. So let me see here. So I guess there was this good hypothesis here, around velocity-based training providing a lot of value in terms of, improving those adaptations and making the training more effective. And like you said, there's a lot of influencers, researchers out there claiming that. So I don't know if you've answered this, Sam, but I'm just curious, going into this, did you think it was going to be more effective versus traditional resistance training?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
I didn't.
Don't give the game away.
No, I'm not. I didn't, which was one of the reasons that was a motivating factor to do the review, because as you say, it's got a lot of the theoretical assumptions behind velocity-based training are really strong. And I think it would be nice to get to a position at some point where we can say for certain whether it is better or not. I just don't think we're there yet, which we'll get onto, I'm sure, when we discuss the results.
Yeah. And just to be really clear, because I think this was confusing for me, so I'm just trying to make this really clear for the listeners. And let me see if I've got this right, and then you can correct me. So we're talking about traditional resistance training would have used task failure, so training to failure, using a one repetition max or a percentage of one repetition max. Let's say that's 70%, and then just kind of arbitrarily training to failure during every session, or training to a set number of repetitions. So it's not being adjusted based on real-time feedback. Really, it's just that's the focus, and that's what we're going to do for training, and hope that produces the best outcomes in terms of strength, power, and sprint speed. What velocity-based feedback training is doing is actually looking at real-time performance based on the speed of the bar, tracking that, and then adjusting load based on velocity, based on your movement speed. So, okay, I move slower today than normal, therefore I'll reduce the weight, and that might actually help me to recover and produce a better performance overall and produce better outcomes in terms of strength, power, and sprint speed. Is that a fair summary of this kind of hypothesis?
That's a fantastic summary, Lawrence.
Okay.
I probably shouldn't be here talking about the paper myself. I think you could probably
Don't be
do a better
silly.
job than I could.
No,
No,
no.
yeah, exactly. I couldn't put it by myself. No, it's a very good summary. So the traditional resistance training approaches are what you just said, and what most of us tend to use. Using a percentage of 1RM, 70% of 1RM for 8 repetitions. Let's say as an example, using repetitions in reserve. Okay, I'm going to stop 2 repetitions before failure, or I'm going to go to failure, or using something like rating of perceived exertion. I'm going to exercise and perform this set at an 8 out of 10, and that has become quite popular in recent years in powerlifters as well.
Okay. So let's get into, you'll soon see that I have no idea what I'm talking about when we get into the statistics. But do you just want to give, as we were saying, sort of before we get started, just a high level view, because I'm just also aware of time, of the structure of the paper. So we'll start with methods, go to search strategy, inclusion criteria, just kind of provide a cursory overview of this stuff, just so the listeners can understand, the design of this study, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said at the start, we systematically reviewed the literature to find studies that have directly compared these 2 training strategies, velocity-based training versus another form of resistance training, more traditional form of resistance training, for example, using a percentage of 1RM, and also that measured the effectiveness on outcomes, including strength, sprint speed, and muscle power. What I think is really important to mention is that we pre-registered, so we prospectively registered exactly what we intended to do. So before we performed any searches, any analysis, we said exactly this is what we're going to do. These are the databases we're going to search. This is the search strategy we're going to use. This is the statistical analysis we're going to use. So we said exactly what we wanted to do. So we were interested in studies that had involved all apparently healthy participants aged over 16 years old. We were primarily interested in randomized trials because they provide the best source of evidence when you're looking at the difference between 2 interventions. And again, we were interested in the outcomes of strength, which was typically 1 repetition maximum, power, which was counter movement jump, and, for example, power produced in a back squat, and linear sprint speed, which is usually over between 5 and 30 meters. Mm-hmm. We searched 8 published journals, and we also searched, 5 published journals in addition to 3 other forms of registries, so trial registries, and we looked for ongoing and unpublished studies as well. So not just published studies, we did a very thorough search of the grey literature too. We then essentially we found the studies that met our eligibility criteria, and then we extracted all those data from the studies. So we said, okay, these studies have found this. Let's extract the data so then we can combine the data from those studies a little bit later. We also evaluated the risk of bias in studies. So for each study, we evaluated the risk of bias, and that's essentially looking at features of the study that might give misleading results. So if there's a specific feature of a study that might give you a misleading result, we have a very systematic way of evaluating that risk of bias. And in addition to evaluating the risk of bias within each study, we appraised the overall quality of the evidence. So we looked at the evidence as a whole with all the studies in it, again, using a very systematic approach. That looks at 5 elements to judge that quality of evidence. That's the risk of bias that I just mentioned. Also, inconsistency between the results, imprecision of the results, which is basically where you don't know where the effect lies. Indirectness, which is essentially if we think velocity-based training is best for athletes, but all studies measured it in inactive people, then that might be an example of indirectness and evidence of publication bias. So essentially, we did a very thorough search of the existing evidence. We found our studies that met the criteria, which I'll talk through. I'm showing the results. We then extracted the data from all those studies. We then looked at those studies in terms of their risk of bias and the quality of the overall evidence. And then what we did was we performed a really comprehensive analysis after we extracted the data from each studies. And essentially what we did was pool the data from all those studies into then one one effect estimate. So each study has an individual effect estimate that they think the effect is. We then took all them and pooled them all together. And this tends to improve the accuracy and the precision of the effect, because different studies might have mixed results, but when you pull them all together, you tend to improve the accuracy and the precision, which is why this type of research, a systematic review and meta-analysis, is considered the gold standard of generating evidence. Isn't always the case, but typically.
Yeah. This episode is brought to you by Strength Portal. You need a software platform that enables you to track workouts, deliver consistent high-quality client experiences, and scale your business. The problem is you're still using pen and paper or basic spreadsheets to run your business, which leads to inconsistent workout experiences and stifles your business growth, making you feel frustrated. Strength Portal have worked closely with the HIIT industry to create a software platform to manage and scale your niche business. Strength Portal is used by multiple businesses in the high-intensity strength training community, namely Discover Strength, Smart Strength Austin, MedX Precision Fitness, and more. To help support the podcast, go to strengthportal.com/high-intensity business and sign up for your ideal package now. That's strengthportal.com/high-intensity business. And now back to the episode. Yeah, it comes down to the study design of the meta-analysis itself, doesn't it? Which Absolutely. In this case, it's like looks super rigorous. And yeah, there's something I wanted to ask you about is, you hear a lot of people critique exercise science as a whole. Scientists from outside exercise and other fields, engineers, they look at some of the science done in exercise and they laugh at it. They just think it's very poorly controlled, or whatever, lots of bias, and they comment on this lack of rigor. And I feel like what you're trying to address here is use a very rigorous approach to analyze. Unfortunately, is quite low quality research, but it's all we got, right? Yeah. And that's what you're trying to do here. So it just seems to me like you and the likes of other, your colleagues, James Steele, Fisher, I always feel like you're trying to provide more rigor all the time. You're trying to increase the quality of what we have, because ultimately we're just trying to find a clearer explanation for objective reality, right? And that's what we're doing. Each paper is like just a slightly clearer explanation is how I've come to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I like to think we try and move a tiny bit closer to the truth with each paper that comes out. But absolutely, Lawrence, that was a real motivating factor behind doing the review. There was a few of us actually who had a discussion, including James Steele, who introduced us about the sort of quality of science and evidence in exercise science, and as you say, because we've got quite a poor reputation, and I think, unfortunately, velocity-based training is a research field that tends to have poor studies undertaken in that, small sample sizes and low rigor studies. One of my studies contributes to that evidence, so I'm not excluded from that. My previous studies. And one of the motivating factors was like, okay, what can we do to highlight this to researchers in the field? Really rigorously test for things like the quality and risk of bias among these studies, and how can we object, rather than just send out a tweet or something like that and say, oh, these studies are rubbish. It's no, how can we more objectively and systematically follow guidelines that are for essentially, medical trials, and I don't see why we shouldn't aim for that sort of standard. And we wanted to systematically say, okay, or have a look at the quality of this evidence.
Yeah, and like you say, maybe inspire others to take it to the next step and form part of that journey with the research. Yeah, it's tough though, isn't it? Because I guess a lot of the time it's very difficult to do high quality clinical trials to get enough participants. Obviously is a real problem. Doing longitudinal studies is really hard, expensive. A lot of the times, I guess organizations, if they fund it, well, then there's an conflict of interest or whatever. So that, I guess, can be one challenge. But then until the kind of, is it not fair to say that until the kind of trials, these single studies are improved, it's always going to be a little bit difficult with the meta-analysis. I know that's subjective and it depends on what we're talking about. I mean, certainly the problem here, but is that meta-analysis is going to be usually somewhat incomplete unless we can do some more productive, higher quality research. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The meta-analysis is based on the studies that it involves, and if the studies are bad, the meta-analysis is probably not going to produce that informative information. However, I must say that a systematic review and meta-analysis isn't just to come up with, okay, this effect is this. Is it better or worse than this intervention? It's also to do things like appraise the quality of evidence, have a look at where all the knowledge gaps are. Is there a risk of bias within studies that we can try and improve in the future? So I do think they still have their use in these contexts, but yes, absolutely, there's still you probably can't. It's more of a tool to highlight some of the issues currently in the empirical evidence, rather than a tool to move us closer to the truth. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. It's how you can improve on. It's like studying studies. So you can improve it in the future, which makes a lot of sense, and there's a lot of value in that. I can see, especially obviously to academics. It's funny though, and I'm hinting at the outcomes here, but I thought, you know what, there is going to be so many velocity-based training advocates who see this and they just look at all the flaws and they go, oh well, this is these studies are low quality and it's inconclusive, and I still think velocity-based training is the way forward, but I have the opposite view. but I just think that's funny how it's a good example of how people can interpret it in different ways, I guess.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So I guess we're sort of moving to results now, are we? So shall I share my screen and bring up the paper?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Okay. So this is always an interesting moment of the podcast where I try and make sure I actually get this right. So here we go.
No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. Can you see that?
I can see that.
Yeah, great. I got this good version of the paper on Taylor Francis online, because you can actually, I don't know if you use this, but it's good for reading the paper and then you can just bring up the different images. So obviously at the start of so you can see all this, right?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. All right, just double checking. So yeah, at the start of this conversation, we're really just talking about introduction and then methods which have no graphs. So I thought, you know what, the audience doesn't want to just see a bunch of words. So now that we are at the results, we can actually look at more, although there was actually one graph out there, isn't there? We can look at a bit more graphs to support what you're saying. So here we are. So we got to the results, and once you went through all the criteria for study selection, you ended up with just 4 studies, right?
Yes. Yeah, just 4.
So do you want to just resume from the results part of the paper, and then I can bring up these graphs on request?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you say, we only found 4 studies that met the criteria, which is really, really low for a whole research field. We did perform a little sidetrack. We did perform a sensitivity analysis where we included 3 extra studies, 3 studies that didn't quite meet the eligibility criteria, but were close. Essentially, they were non-randomized studies. I think there was 2 extra studies, actually, 2 extra studies, and they were non-randomized studies, which there's no reason that we should have non-randomized studies in this research field to answer the research question. But I put them in anyway, just to see if that made a difference. But anyhow, the original and primary results were just from 4 studies. That's correct. Median sample size, if we talked about small samples, was 23, and that's the overall, not just in each group, which is of course very small. The range was 16 to 27, and studies use a combination of either the velocity zones and the velocity loss thresholds. So the 4 studies used different approaches there, and the comparison group was typically a percentage of 1RM. So most studies used a percentage of 1RM, and the interventions lasted for 6 to 8 weeks. So twice a week for 6 to 8 weeks. So it's quite homogeneous there. Most of the studies were similar. And I see here you've got got the flow diagram graph up, and that essentially just shows, okay, we started from, I think it was 572 studies, potential studies from the thorough search we did. And then we went through very systematically, removed the duplicates, removed records based on the title because there were nothing to do with it. We then looked at the full text and excluded those studies that didn't meet our eligibility criteria, and eventually got to 4 studies that are included in the review. So that's all that shows.
Okay. All right.
So you want to scroll down? I've gone through most of the study characteristics. Okay. Near misses, that's what I was just talking about. We included them in this in a sensitivity analysis. Mm-hmm. Now, the risk of bias was either high for one study or some concerns. So this is based on 5 different areas that we systematically appraised a study for a risk of bias, and 3 had overall some concerns, and 1 was, as you can see there in red, was a high risk of bias. And that was mainly due to unclear randomization processes. It wasn't clear from the paper at all how participants were randomized. A lack of outcome assessor blinding, and by that I mean, if I'm the researcher doing collecting the data, so if I'm measuring people's strength before and after the intervention, I shouldn't know whether they're in the velocity-based training group or percentage-based training group. Because if I want velocity-based training to be better, and then I might, even subconsciously or consciously, affects the results somehow. So ideally, you don't want to know what group the participants are in, but that wasn't the case. And also a lack of pre-registration. I said at the start that we, as a team, we said exactly what we're going to do before we conducted the review. And unfortunately, all other studies in the area, including my own, you can see there in 2019, including my own, hadn't done that as part of their studies.
So what had they done instead? Sorry, just so I understand.
They just so they'd reported the paper and said, we did this, and this is how we analysed it, and this is what we measured. Mm-hmm. We have absolutely no idea whether that was always the intention. The issue is researchers could measure 40 different outcomes and then only report 5 because those 5 are statistically significant in the actual paper. And as readers now, we see, 5 measures have improved and greater in the velocity training group. Fantastic, that's better. But that forgets the other 35 that either there weren't any difference or it favoured the alternative group. And so that's one reason why saying exactly what you're going to do before you conduct the study is really important.
And were you relieved that you had no big red crosses in your study, Sam?
Well, interesting to say that. So I wasn't involved in the risk of bias assessment. 2 other colleagues performed that because of that reason. And you know what? I would have taken that. I would have. It is what it is, and if they deemed it to be high risk of bias, then I would have accepted that. I don't have that many talents, Lawrence, but I think one of them is to be able to take criticism and move on. Maybe I've got a thick skin. So I would have not been happy or sad with that. It just, the study is what it is.
That's great. Well, it's great that you like that, because it's exactly what you have to be, right? As a scientist, you have to be, kill your darlings and all of that stuff, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's good to hear. Okay, so now we're looking at outcomes. So starting with muscle strength.
Yeah, muscle strength. So there was the muscle strength outcomes involve 10 different measures of outcomes. You can see there, all of them were 1 repetition maximum from these 4 studies. So some studies measured strength, for example, 4 different ways. So you can sample the last study held in 2021 measured strength in the bench press, deadlift, bench row, and back squat. And using a sophisticated form of multi-level meta-analysis, you can then include those within one meta-analysis. It involved 10 effect estimates, and essentially what you see in here, you can see the pooled effect right at the bottom, so the bottom triangle that overlaps 0. You can see that pooled effect, and essentially, Lawrence, what that's saying is we don't have a clue whether velocity-based training is better or any worse than alternative forms of resistance training. That's essentially what that says. It says it looks like there's a very, very small difference. It looks like that. So you can see there's 0.06 on the right-hand side. And these are turned into standardized effects. Without getting too much into that, basically 0.2 is trivial, 0.5 is moderate, and 0.8 is large. You can see 0.06, much less than 0.2, which would suggest it's a trivial effect between. But when you look at the two numbers next to it, you can see a minus 0.5 and a plus 0.63. I said that those standardized effects are moderate, so anything above 0.5 plus or minus are moderate. So that's suggesting that based on our analysis, velocity-based training could be moderately worse than alternative strength training or moderately better than alternative methods. And so what this is essentially saying is we don't know if it's any better or worse for improving strength.
Thank you for that. That was a really clearly explained, because this does confuse myself a lot. But now I understand that much better. So thank you for that. All right, great. So, okay, moving on. Should we talk about these interesting funnel plots?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is looking for something called small study effects, and pure meta-analysts would shout at me for saying this looks at publication bias, but essentially that's what it does. It's sort of a surrogate measure of publication bias, and what you would find if what a asymmetrical funnel. So if all the dots, for example, were laid in an asymmetrical way, that would suggest that there's some publication bias going on. So that would suggest that people were either measuring outcomes, as I gave my previous example, or conducting whole studies that when it wasn't statistically significant, they were just putting it in their file drawer and not publishing it, and only publishing the statistically significant studies. Which wasn't the case here. We only had 10 studies to look for, which is probably the minimum you can do this with. 10 effect estimates from 4 studies, which is the minimum you can do this with, really. But there wasn't any preliminary evidence of publication bias, which is positive.
Yeah, very good. All right, so now we're talking about muscle power.
Yeah, and unfortunately, here's where I'm going to get a little bit repetitive, because we're essentially seeing a similar thing to what we did from strength. You can see if we use our benchmarks again of 0.2 and 0.5 and 0.8, the overall effect, which you can see in the horizontal diamond at the bottom, is 0.11, which suggests that it's a trivial effect. It's smaller than small, essentially. And if you look at the two numbers next to it, which essentially suggests where it gives you a number of uncertainty. So our best guess is 0.11, but we still have a level of uncertainty. So it's likely to be anywhere. The true effect is likely to be anywhere from minus 0.28 to 0.49, which again suggests that we don't really know whether velocity-based training improves power or not compared to alternative resistance training. It could be a small effect in either direction in terms of power.
Got it. All right. And then finally, we're looking at sprint time.
And again, very similar story. It was just like strength and power, a very small difference between the two. But our best guess is still very, very imprecise. So a moderate effect in favor of the comparator, which is the percentage of 1 RM training, and it could be a moderate effect in favor of velocity-based training. So again, this was a little even more varied and even more imprecise that we don't really know. It's very unclear where, based on the current evidence, it is very, very unclear and imprecise whether velocity-based training is worse or better for these outcomes.
Okay. All right. So let's see here. So what do we have? Shall we skip over, just aware of time, the rest of this? Or do you want to touch on meta-aggressions, pre-post effects? Do you want to give maybe a high-level summary of any of this stuff, or you already touched on
perhaps I'll just give a summary of meta-aggressions. Didn't really find anything, and it's a small number of studies to do that with. Perhaps I'll just touch on the quality of evidence. I don't know if you've scrolled past that just very quickly.
Right there.
There we go. So basically, the quality of evidence was overall very low. That was mainly due to two main things. One was the risk of bias, which we just looked at, which I said in the methods that feeds into this quality of evidence appraisal. So that was one of the reasons why the overall quality of evidence in this research field was considered very low, was because of the risk of bias within these individual studies. And the other reason was small sample sizes, extremely small sample sizes. So as an example, the grade assessment, which is a systematic way to appraise the quality of evidence in the research field, their rule of thumb is that if the overall pooled sample size is less than 400, then you should be marked down. So the overall research field should be marked down. And the overall sample sizes in this field, in the total, I think there were less than 100. There were less than 100 because the median was 23, I think. And so that's just showing that the sample sizes in this field still aren't even reaching anywhere near the sort of the smallest sample size that would be considered okay in a medical field. And so basically, it was the quality of evidence was low due to risk of bias within individual studies and these low sample sizes.
And that's, as we were saying, that's the difficulty in exercise science, right? Is trying to get those bigger sample sizes.
It's very difficult.
Yeah. So I guess in conclusion, there's obviously a statement in the abstract, which I'll just read, which really summarizes what you just said, which is currently there's no evidence that velocity-based training and traditional resistance training methods lead to different alterations in muscle strength, power, or linear sprint speed. So that's where we are. That's where we are in terms of the evidence for that.
Absolutely. There's currently not, from the empirical evidence, there's currently no evidence. And where I mean is no evidence, just to reiterate what I said when we we're going through the results, is it's very unclear. It could be better or it could be worse. We don't know from the current evidence. I think, of course, there is more nuanced than that. And if I can, I'll just share some thoughts of my own experiences, or as a researcher in velocity-based training and participating in it myself. I think if there is an added benefit of velocity-based training, and the theory suggests that there might be, it's probably really small. So we know ourselves, traditional resistance training, whether you go to the gym a few times a week, you lift close to a failure, and you keep doing that for many months and years, you're going to get stronger and you're going to get more muscular, et cetera, et cetera. There's going to be adaptations. And so traditional resistance training is pretty damn good. It's a good way to improve those outcomes. And so if velocity-based training is better, it's going to be small. The issue with that, if we're going to actually tease out those small differences, we need really big sample sizes, which currently we don't have. I also think I've mentioned the average Joe quite a lot here. I also think for average Joe, velocity-based training probably isn't going to be that much more beneficial. You mentioned in the preamble that all roads tend to lead to Rome. I think that's probably the case here for us, just average lifters. It might be more useful, some forms of velocity-based training. I genuinely think it might be more useful for athletes training multiple times per day. For example, when I was training full time in rugby league, we used to train around 3 times per day, and so it might be better for managing fatigue in those sort of contexts, particularly during the in-season when you've got games thrown in there as well.
But is the other question that could be thrown in there is, should you really be training 3 times a day? Is that not a little bit over the top?
So I probably should clarify, not training as in resistance training, training as in and some athletes nowadays may correct me, this is a little while ago, but it might be in the morning, it might be some sort of prehab or wrestle for a rugby league player, and then late morning it might be weights, and then in the afternoon it's probably field. And so it's not just in the gym, but of course, fatigue in the gym will carry over into different parts of training as well.
Yeah. How long were you a professional rugby player for?
I'd signed professionally when I was 16 and stopped playing when I was 21. It's a quite long, convoluted story, and I don't have much time. But essentially, I was injured many, many times. 2 ACL reconstructions, a broken vertebrae, reconstructed shoulder in about 4 years.
Oh, wow.
And then it's not just the injuries that catch up with you. If you haven't played for 4 years, you actually end up not being very good. It's quite a key developmental, period between sort of 17 and 21 with only a handful of games. So then I stopped playing. But so 16 to 21, something like that.
Okay, yeah. Well, you're mentally, cognitively, you're obviously top of your game, clearly. And you don't know if that would be the case if you had a longer rugby career, right? Potentially.
Well, absolutely. Particularly with what's going on at the moment. Yeah, absolutely.
What do you mean what's going on at the moment? Am I missing something?
Oh, no, there's a lot of cases about
I see.
more in rugby union, I think.
Yeah.
I played real rugby league. Sorry to all the southern England listeners. But so there's a lot of players having early onset dementia, and whether that's linked to playing rugby, I'm not sure, but perhaps. And I think there's
Sorry, I remember them talking about it in Premier League, actually talking about training and number of headers you could do in training and all this kind of thing. So sorry, it's been a bit out of the popular media for a while, so I forgot about that. Sam, we're at time, and I just want to say thank you so much for doing this. I'll just stop sharing my screen here so we can move on to the next bit here. But this has been great. Thanks for, I know we did a very kind of high level view of the paper, but it's still really useful to just maybe, talk about it in a bit more in other ways and talk about other issues that are related to it. Is there any, in terms of if anyone's got any questions, can they contact you in any way? You don't have to give emails if you get enough emails already, but is that an avenue for that?
No, absolutely. First of all, thanks for having me on, Lawrence. It's a great opportunity to talk about the paper, so thank you. And absolutely, if anyone wants to chat more about this research or velocity-based training or resistance training in general, more than happy to speak with them. My email is sam.orange@newcastle.ac.uk. The best way to get that is probably just type in Sam Orange Newcastle into Google, and you'll be directed to my the staff page.
Cool. Yeah. And just reading your bio in terms of your expertise in cancer, that's fascinating to me. So I'm sure there's more stuff we could talk about in the future if you're willing to return to the show, Sam.
Absolutely.
And for everyone listening, to find the blog post for this episode, please go to highintensitybusiness.com, search for episode 379. And until next time, thank you very much for listening. This episode is brought to you by Strength Portal. You need a single software platform that enables your trainers to deliver consistent, high-quality workouts, track client progress, and scale your business. The problem is you're still using pen and paper or basic spreadsheets to run your business, which leads to poor client experiences, inaccurate tracking, and prevents you from growing your business, making you feel frustrated. Strength Portal understand your challenge and have worked closely with the HIIT industry to create a software platform to manage and scale your niche business. You can integrate with MindBody, manage a standardized exercise and workout library for your team, track workouts effectively, and produce client reports at the click of a button. Strength Portal is used by multiple businesses in the high-intensity strength training community, namely Discover Strength, Smart Strength Austin, MedX Precision Fitness, and more. Starting with Strength Portal is super simple. Number 1, sign up for the best package for your business. Number 2, let Strength Portal take the load off and help onboard your business onto the platform. And number 3, start delivering consistent workout experiences and scale your business to the next level. To help support the podcast, please go to strengthportal.com/high-intensity business and sign up now, so you can stop feeling frustrated about your business and start to scale your business to its true potential. Go to strengthportal.com/high-intensity business.